United States sometimes.
Yeah, so in the meta-analyses, which I didn't directly compare here, that the effects are a little larger for Americans than they are for Canadians in terms of self-enhancement motivations, and Japanese are a little more self-critical than our Chinese.
I noticed that. My response would have been, the studies didn't take into consideration Americans have a collective belief. They saved the world in World War II from Hitler. And therefore their self-esteem is directly related to that, where Japanese are probably walking around with a guilt trip that were bombed in Hiroshima.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point that historical events are going to contribute to cultural norms. And I would have been interested to have done these kinds of studies during the fascist era leading up to World War II in Japan, whether we would have found the same kinds of differences then that you do now. So I do view culture as a influx, that it's changing. I think there's elements that do persist. I think a lot of these things, a lot of the tendencies underlying these differences, I think do probably extend back for, well, centuries. But I think that short-term historical effects are going to impact these as well.
I would make one other point. The Western civilizations are basically come from feudal societies. The Eastern societies come from caste. If you come from a caste system, you're going to behave.
Right. Although Japan was a feudal society, it was the longest-lasting feudal society. It was feudal until 1858. So this is one way that Japan is actually similar to Europe, with having this feudal past. So in the Japanese case. Yeah.
So, thanks, Steve. Very interesting material. Many of these different angles of attack that you're taking to the project manipulate framing and motivation in different ways, right? And I'm wondering if it's possible, and perhaps this is in the meta-analysis already, you or somebody else has already done it, to simply try and keep motivation constant to the extent that you can. And one way of doing that would be to take, say, an above-average paradigm and incentivize accuracy, right? Now, you might say, well, but if there are self-presentation norms, then that's a competing incentive in itself.
Right.
But presumably, people have a price point, right? That is, if you pay them enough, they increase their accuracy everywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm curious whether anyone's done that, and if not, what do you think would happen?
Well, it's funny you say it, because we collaborating with Joe right now on that very study, and because Joe's an economics background, and so for economists, something's not real unless it's incentivized. I mean, I'm curious with what we're going to find. On the one hand, I would think that we have multiple motivations, and that I might, even though I might be motivated to view myself positively, there are times that I will, if it's incentivized, at least I can reflect upon these other aspects of myself. So I mean, I think I do probably sometimes, some aspects of myself, I might have a more accurate view that I just prefer not to think about. I'm curious what we're going to find if it is the sense that incentivizing it makes everyone more accurate, or if it's the case that incentivizing it here is just allowing this accuracy motive to be stronger relative to the self-enhancing motive. I think that's another way of thinking about this. I don't know if it necessarily is going to call into question that the motivation for self-enhancement might differ, just that sometimes money motivation can be stronger than the self-enhancement. So I think we have a multiplicity of views about ourselves, and depending on the day, if you remember, times when I remember this especially when you're applying for jobs, and that there's some days you think, oh, I'm going to get a great job, and other days you think, no one's ever going to hire me. And depending on the most recent thing that you had heard, the fluctuating in your views about yourself. So I do think we have a multiplicity of views about the self, and we probably can, incentives could bring one or more of those views to the forefront. What we're going to do, we're working on that study right now, so in a year or so I should have a good answer to that question. Yeah?
A couple of questions. First is that the notion of faith. originally comes from study of Chinese societies, and the literature you cited mostly about the Chinese notion of faith.
Yeah.
And as that gentleman said, actually there's a huge difference between Japan and China. The fundamental difference is Japan, as you just said, has been for a long time a feudalistic society over China. That's it. So I wonder if you summarize, most of your subjects are actually Japanese, and you're using the Chinese notion of faith, which has been very popular in English literature, whether there's a little bit methodology. I don't know. So this is one thing.
Japanese do talk about face using the same word, it's the same characters too, from China. It's possible that it is more of a concern with Chinese face, although at least looking at our meta-analysis results. So the cultural difference between Chinese and North Americans, the D-score is about 0.7, and the cultural difference between Japanese and North Americans is about 0.9. Koreans are also like Japanese, around 0.9. Although they're different kinds of studies, so it is actually hard to, people aren't all in the same study, so it's hard to evaluate that. I do think though that my experiences with Chinese suggest that the Japanese case might be more extreme than Chinese, especially recently, things like a one-child policy. There's a lot of poor grandparents focusing their attention on one kid. That I think these kinds of change in policies here, I think are going to change the cultures and might change the kinds of effects that we see. One other source of information that Japanese and Chinese are at least in the same ballpark, though, is actually none of the studies I talked about here today. Many of our studies, though, also include an Asian Canadian group. From UBC, we have immigrants to Canada, the bulk of whom are from China or Hong Kong. And they tend to show results as intermediate to our European Canadians and our either Hong Kong samples or our Japanese samples. So I think this is something that you can also acculturate to. But yeah, I think it'd be interesting to do more studies contrasting Japanese with Chinese in the same study, and there just haven't been very many of those.
My second concern is about your review of the second alternative account.
Yeah, yeah.
That is the statement versus private feelings.
Yeah.
And the way you did it is basically, it seems that there's only two possibilities. One is you say something, versus you actually feel something else entirely. That's the alternative account. I think that account itself may be too simplified, and the way you reviewed it may be misled by their simplicity. I think there's a lot of things in between which might be summarized as a cultural intimacy. The notion of cultural intimacy meaning there's a very refined, moralized way to state yourself. To state yourself, yeah. Still feeling the same thing. In other words, I see there is a matching between the statement and the inner feeling. Just the expression is different.
Right.
For instance, in this kind of settings, which is not my primary interest group, I would never ever be the first to raise a question. However, that doesn't mean I don't have a question.
Right.
I just wait until the third, maybe the fourth. This is just part of me. It's a cultural intimacy.
Yeah.
And another simple example is that, again, taking Chinese group as an example, almost every single Chinese person, especially male, wanted to be the boss. If you see they have a lower self-enhancement, then you can hardly explain why Americans tend to be more able or easier to cooperate with each other, to have teamwork, while the Chinese don't. If they have teamwork, there got to be, it's not the same kind of a teamwork on equal base. There's a hierarchical structure there.
Yeah.
So it's not a cooperation, it's discipline.
Discipline.
Yes.
As in
Versus cooperation under this at an equal footing. So I'm just thinking there's a lot more interesting things behind all of this.
Yeah.
I really enjoy all these contrasts, so don't get me wrong. It's just thinking there's much more deeper things.
Well, I mean, that's the, it is always a challenge trying to first of all, summarize a whole culture with one sample, and then with a given task. Especially when that given task, it's different results across cultures, and trying to think of all the different things that would lead to that difference across cultures. And so I suggested 4 different processes that were involved. We actually have a couple more that we can find linked here too, but I think there still are all alternative kinds of explanations. And the one that I find most challenging still is this, the second alternative explanation of, because it is clear that in terms of self-presentation there are these cultural differences, especially between Japan and North America in terms of how to present oneself. And so getting at what is it that our measures are really measuring is always a challenge, and I think cross-cultural studies are one that sort of forces you to wrestle with that challenge.
Yeah.
These are just small points, but one of the interesting things that we've observed in self-enhancement data is a geographic effect. And when we were first studying positive beliefs about the self, Californians were off the map in terms of self-enhancement relative to, say, Massachusetts samples that we had had, and I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. That, it's become less so, and one of the interesting questions is that because our university is becoming more Asian, and we use a lot of university samples, and I wondered, since you have a similar experience at UBC with your populations becoming more Asian, whether you see any changes in your, you talked about the changes, how the difference in the Asian Americans versus the Asians, but what about any changes in the Canadians?
Yeah. Well, first I should point out, in UBC, our challenge, maybe it's like that here at UCLA, is getting European Canadians is a challenge in our studies. Male European Canadians, filling that cell is just always a real challenge, because we are 60% Asian in our sample. But, so it's been, the change since I've been there has been relatively small percentage, but I do have a good set of data that addresses this. So Jean Twenge has been doing this research looking at cohort differences in self-esteem. And she's arguing that, self-esteem has increased since the 1960s in various samples of Americans, looking at these big meta-analyses of the same Rosenberg self-esteem scale. That scores have increased by a D of about 0.6 since the 1960s to the 2000s. And then at UC Davis, Kali Tresnevsky has been arguing, but in their samples, they're not finding, the UC Davis samples, they're not finding this increase. And Jean Twenge's reanalysis showing it's because of the increasing Asians in UC Davis that is actually keeping the average self-esteem, and that if you look just at the European Americans, it has actually increased at UC Davis. And that, so it is the changing demographics of the schools that are reflecting, in this case, the absence of increases over time in self-esteem. So, yeah, so that's, I find this really intriguing that these cultural norms are changing over time, and that in the 2000s, Jean Twenge calls it, Generation Me, which is this narcissism epidemic is what she's arguing for, and that this is more pronounced now than it used to be. And this is data pre-Facebook. I'm wondering how the Facebook generation, if that's going to increase. It's an apparent kind of narcissism that you see on Facebook. People only show you what their positive accomplishments. Yes.
Have any of these studies looked at the role of socioeconomic status?
Yeah, a little bit. We did, so in general, there is some evidence of higher self-enhancement levels among higher SES Americans and lower SE Americans. And we did a study in Japan, and it was, we didn't notice couldn't tell any differences in the small study we did in Japan, but we really don't have much data on SES in Japan. It's, I would think in general that with SES comes face, so I would expect that overall there should be this shift in East Asian context as well as Western context associated with success, right? More things you can point to of how your life is doing well. One other thing that there's some evidence that as Japanese age, their self-esteem is higher. And I think as you rise through an age-oriented hierarchy, so that part of these differences might be that they're almost all university students capturing people where they're below in the hierarchy, and that there's sort of a temporal dimension to this as well. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question for your series of studies reporting the self-criticalness between the difference between Japanese and North Americans. And I'm not sure that the Japanese are more self-critical than the Americans, and how critical they would be towards others. They will be more critical or more looser. There seems to be a little bit tricky because if Japanese is more critical in judging others, and they have the perception that others can do the same thing to them,
Right.
but there's a potential higher cost of criticism.
Right.
And if they're not critical to others and they tend to be nice to others, to reduce the cost, and why their self-perception would be that others are judging them, and what would be the potential cost of praise to them.
Right.
So it seems to me pretty tricky.
Yeah. So some of our data speaks to this in the sense that in some of these studies, we actually are asking people to evaluate themselves and evaluating others too. And we do find more other criticism in Japanese, at least the less positive evaluations of others, especially others, well, a lot of these studies, others in your in-group, that they're just less positive more generally. That the attention to weaknesses is not just in my own weaknesses, but an attention to weaknesses. There's more prevention orientation more generally, looking at books, being critical of books that you encounter. So I think that it is a more general, my feeling is it's more general orientation towards places where there's room for improvement. And it's meant in a constructive way, like the Japanese teacher that's working with criticizing the students. It was meant in a constructive way. And I think because we prioritize self-esteem in the West, that criticism often goes against that goal. And so criticism is, I think, often felt more negatively. Because one thing we found in these studies where we manipulate success and failure, another thing I didn't mention, we asked people how they feel about their performance. And the Japanese had a smaller effect of their feelings of the manipulation than the Americans did. Americans felt great when they succeeded, felt horrible when they did bad. And the Japanese moved too, but it was to a smaller degree. And I think this, again, if you think about abilities as enduring, then criticism hurts, because it's saying that you are bad and you're never going to get better. But if you're thinking about abilities as a product of efforts, then calling attention to a weakness is just pointing the spotlight of where you need to work. So I think that the criticism is more general than just towards itself.
There's a puzzle which comes to my mind from data like the one you showed us. If I didn't know anything about the work, just coming from math now and attending this talk, I would think, so this society in which people are, when they're criticized, they try to self-improve themselves, and there's this other one in which criticism just makes them think that the test is bad. I would think that the first one would be much more successful in producing innovation and so on. That's not what we see.
Yeah.
So how have you thought about that puzzle? Do you agree it's a puzzle, or?
Yeah. Well, I think there's more than one way of forming a successful society. And I think our American results suggest, and I think this is backed up by look at the society, is that Americans are more of a society of specialists, in the sense that, and I think this goes, again, to where does this come from? At least one place that's contributed to this is, I think, Protestantism. Martin Luther's introducing the idea of a calling, that God's given everyone a purpose to do here on earth, and you have to find out what your purpose is. And God doesn't want redundancy, so your purpose is different from someone else's purposes. And so the idea that there's something that, everyone is good at something. I need to find out what I'm good at. And so if I'm bad at something, well, avoid that task, keep working until I find the thing that I'm good at, and then focus on that and to specialize then. And I think the Japanese model suggests more of a model towards generalists. And what I found interesting in our results too is that the Japanese do quit sooner than Americans when they're doing well. That's when they quit. I'm good at this test. I don't have to work on it anymore. So if you're sort of focusing on weaknesses and working towards improving them, sort of getting to a minimal level of performance and all of that, then you'll be sort of more of a jack of all trades. And if you look at traditionally employment practices, Japanese lifetime employment, which has been weakening over the last couple decades in Japan, but it's still quite prominent in large companies, is a typical way is an employee is hired there and then is rotated every few years to a different division. So they're in marketing for the first few years and they move over to manufacturing and move over to accounting. The idea is you become a real company person, become an expert on the company and all the workings of the company. And in the US, people change jobs much more, and they often develop a skill, become like the network analyst skill, in that you can change jobs and bring your network analyst skills to this other job and have this become great at this one set of skills, and you can build a successful society, I think, with both of these strategies. One where you're trying to make everyone sort of an expert on the company versus a company based on individuals with different specializations. Yes?
So I disagree with you a little bit about the social differences here, and in part this is a function of framing. So when you talk about prevention motivation, right, you emphasize it in terms of East Asians' motivation to recognize areas in which they can improve and to then pursue improvement, right? You say that criticism directed at others is intended constructively in order to facilitate such improvement, right? Those are pretty positive spins, right?
Okay.
There's another spin, which is this is a shame society, right? That people are primarily concerned with avoiding negative evaluation from others in order to protect what little face they have.
Okay.
And that criticism, whether constructive or not, is damaging, and therefore people are motivated to avoid it. Right?
Okay.
I mean,
it is unpleasant. Yeah.
Right. So I'm sure you heard in your education experiences in Japan the common aphorism that the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Right. That is that the safest thing to do is to not stand out, to be like everybody else. And Roberto is right in that historically, while the post-World War II manufacturing revolution in Japan has boosted Japanese economic prowess to a world-class level, most of the innovations, the technological innovations on which that success is based, were not indigenous to Japan. That is, the patents were mostly American patents.
Japan has the highest per capita patent rate right now. They have the most patents each year, continuing to this day. I mean, I agree that a lot of it is improving on other technologies, improving on, but I'm just saying there is innovation still.
Right, but I mean, there's a lot of discussion in Japan, as I understand it, this is mostly coming from people like Tatsuya Kameda and Shinobu Kitayama, about the problem with the lack of willingness to innovate.
Yeah.
Not necessarily ability to innovate, but willingness to innovate in Japan, right? So I think, one way of framing this is that you've accurately characterized an important cross-cultural difference, but you've downplayed the social costs. So when Roberto says a successful society, he was talking in the context, at least in I heard the question, of innovation, not in terms of a stable equilibrium. So it's a stable equilibrium, but the question is whether in a competitive global economy you can continue to be sufficiently innovative to maintain that.
Right. Yeah.
Steve, can I throw a little data into this
Sure.
discussion? Because Jessica Chang, who is here, and I have done a study where we have looked at the biological responses that East Asians and Euro-Americans have to criticism, social strain, those kinds of feedback. And the interesting thing is that among the European Americans, you see heightened inflammatory activity, which is important because inflammation is a common pathway to many chronic disorders. In the Asian Americans, Asian samples, you do not. There is not an inflammatory response to reports of strain and criticism. And that suggests, albeit modestly, that perhaps shame, as you put it, isn't the stressor that it is among the European Americans. It's not producing these adverse biological.
I mean, that's an interesting result, but the problem is, what is the baseline, right? So what is the frequency with which the average Japanese subject encounters criticism compared to that which the average American encounters criticism? So response to any stressor is going to be a function of frequency of exposure, right? And if, you know, my teacher is constantly telling me, that's not good enough, you could have done better, you know, I expect more of you, then that's a different kind of experience to get negative social feedback than if most of the time my teacher is telling me, you know, you and all the other children in Lake Wobegon are above average.
Well,
right?
these are all students who are reporting on their daily activities. Is there a mean difference between the two cultural groups in the amount of social strain that they report?
We don't have the amount.
The number of the
I was just kind of
Right. They're in very similar environments, albeit they have families that.
When you say similar, you mean they're university students?
Well, they're mostly here. They're all here. Yeah, they're either employees or students.
Well, I would also just follow up on the other part of your question regarding innovations. And yeah, I think sort of see the Samsung iPhone kind of debate coming up right now, and I think Korean society probably shares a lot of features here with Japanese society. There's recently been more cross-cultural work on creativity, and I haven't done any of it myself, but this work has been conceptualizing creativity as consisting of two components. One is novelty, and then the other is utility. And this research has been showing that, in general, individualism is associated with generation of more novelty, and that at least collectivism and primes of it is associated with generation of more utility. And really, the ultimate innovation is going to be something new that works. And the idea is, if you're used to working in more of a consensual environment and coming up, the idea is to find the solution that works for everyone here. Let's find how we can move forward here with all of our different views on things. So I think, yeah, there are those two sides to this, and yeah, but I agree that, yeah, the generation of novelty is an issue. This is one thing that Japan's been in this economic funk for a while, and part of the worries there is that in the past, so there's been two big changes actually three big changes in Japanese history. One was the arrival of the Christians in the 16th century, and that changed societies and led to this external Christians coming in, so led to Japan shutting off the country. Then it was the American black ships of Commodore Perry coming in 1858 to force the country open, and that's when Japan changed with this foreign pressure. And then it was the end of World War II, and again it was this foreign pressure that led to this change. And so there's a sense that big changes rarely come from within in Japan, and that they respond well to these external changes and adjust. But that there's such powers of consensus and continuity that these really big changes, and this has been the problem with Japanese politics. So they've been trying new parties, but it's always still the same old, and there's a sort of growing frustration with how can we get out of this funk, how can we get a new direction, and it does seem to be a hard thing to do. Yes?
It's still related to the same question. So one motivation for the question is the question whether you think that is something that we here in the United States should learn from Japanese, Chinese society about how to protect students in universities, how to reward them, how to criticize them. So it's like just a puzzle, because if you want to learn from another society, you want to also check how that society is doing, right?
Right.
So, comments?
Yeah, well, I mean, in general, I think there is lots to be learned from seeing how other cultures do it differently, and trying to model what works well with what doesn't. I think often these intercultural interventions often maybe don't work as well because it's hard sort of just to pick out the aspects that you like for them because they're sort of entangled with all these other kinds of cultural meanings that don't always come bundled with it. I always find it a challenge myself in dealing with I have many East Asian students working with me in my lab, and that I mean I want to always deal with them first as an individual and then kind of see how they're responding and just accordingly. I think it is dangerous to just go with the stereotype that you learn that East Asians think this way, so every time I meet an East Asian I'm going to interact with them this way. All the more so when you're dealing with immigrants in where people are exposed to multiple cultural worlds and how much they're embracing them and what context they're in, that something might work well with sort of the aspect of themselves that's tied to their Asian heritage, but might not work so well with the aspects of themselves that are integrating into mainstream society. So I think it's a challenge. So my preferred way of doing it is always trying to deal with them as everyone as an individual and see how things go and try things. I have a grad student from Hong Kong who thrives on critical feedback. That's all he wants. He's the most extreme I've ever seen of anyone like this. He keeps coming to me, tell me what I can do more, tell me what I can do more. And he's, I think, a real exaggeration of this version that I've been talking about. And he's been in Canada for over a dozen years. So I think at an individual level, it's often hard to predict. Yeah.
I just want to make one comment about the innovation, because the difficulty, I think, is trying to sort of take something like that and put it on top of this kind of framework, is that with innovation on the West side, there's a huge difference between the U.S. and Europe on innovation. The Europeans are very concerned about the fact that they are way below the U.S. in terms of rates of innovation. There are numerous grants, research studies that are being funded for trying to increase the innovation rate to match the U.S. In some ways, the U.S. may be an outlier in terms of that, and not have anything to do with the kind of things you're talking about. But you touched a little bit on something I wanted to bring up a little bit more about, which is the fact that when one's pulling out something like face versus self-esteem and treating them as traits on their own, it seems to me like it's missing the fact that these are embedded into a much larger context.
Right.
And some of the things that came up you mentioned were a question of the notion of boundedness of a group, or a sense of a group and group boundary, which seems to my mind, play a lot with respect to, do you have more of a sense of, I value myself in terms of what I do individually.
Right.
If I don't have a strong sense of a group to which I'm linked, versus if I am very much embedded in a group and have a strong sense of group identity, it would seem to be more concerned with how are the other members of my group seeing me. And in both of them, it seems like the word self-esteem is a bit misleading, because then it seems like one gets into the question of the internal psychological state. That self-esteem sort of suggests what is the internal psychological state, whereas I would assume that somebody, assuming Japan, who is may have a very good internal psychological state on the basis of how they are understanding where they are fitting within the group and basis of the feedback they're getting back. So I'm wondering if the word self-esteem is a bit misleading here, and one should use something that would better characterize the notion of one's is looking at myself as an individual and my own capacity as an individual, as opposed to how do I relate to members of the group and how are they relating to me.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There's a lot in there. And well, I think one way, I guess I didn't even talk about sort of different self-concepts that this is associated with. So Shinobu Kitayama was just here this weekend, and Hazel Marcus have this view of an independent self-concept, which is primarily viewing the self as defined as an individual. Relationships are sort of less self-defining, less of a boundary between in-group and out-group. Self-definition comes more from internal attributes, and an interdependent self being more about how the self is embedded with others and defined by roles. And I think, how this differentiates self-esteem, that we find that there's measures of how independent or how interdependent someone is. And we find that both within Canada and within Japan, the more independent an individual says on completes these scales, the higher is their self-esteem. That independence and self-esteem do seem to go together in a way. And that in both Canada and Japan, the more interdependent the person, the lower is their self-esteem. We find the same kind of correlations, the same value. And suggesting that self-esteem is somewhat at odds with interdependence here. I think if the orientation is towards others. But I think, yeah, this is one of the values, though, of doing cross-cultural work, because in Western psychology, when they're thinking about self-evaluation, they're thinking about it in terms of self-esteem. That's the one way that we primarily think about it. And I think this is, you know, by studying other culture, you can see that, yes, this is of less significance. There wasn't a Japanese word for self-esteem with the same kinds of connotations. That now they use self-esteem, imported the English word, because the Japanese equivalents that are closest to it have kind of an arrogant sound to it. You say someone like they're full of themselves is the closest equivalents. And I think, yeah, by studying other culture, you can see there's other ways of looking at understanding evaluation. I think faces sort of captures the best the way that the Japanese are.
Thanks very much.
Okay.